Hello, this is Elizabeth, and I am the Catholic Lady, and we're reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell, and we are at chapter 51, part 1. The next morning, Saul was brought before the little Sanhedrin. The morning was hot and dark and thunderous, but there was no rain. The judges sat, sweltering in their tiers of chairs, and regarding Saul with stern faces, closed and grim. Ananias the high priest was there, a tall, slender man, whose figure, under his ceremonial robes, was distorted by an amazingly huge belly. Yet all his limbs were thin and his face, and he wore his tall priestly hat, and his garments were splendid and jeweled, and his brown beard perfumed, and there was the priestly ring on his hand, flashing in the hot gloom. His features were intelligent and alert, yet curiously weak and uncertain, and his eyes were baleful as they regarded the man he most hated in all the world. Saul bowed to the Sanhedrin, touched his brow, and then his lips, and then his breast, and said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." Ananias made a sign to the 2 temple guards standing beside Saul, and one struck him violently in the mouth. And Saul staggered, but he did not take his eyes from the high priest. He said, "God shall smite you, you whited wall, for sitting to judge me after the law, and command me to be smitten contrary to the law." Some members of the Sanhedrin shouted, "Do you dare to revile the high priest?" The Saul looked at them bitterly and said in a strong voice, "I would not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people.'" The Roman captain and several of his men had insisted that they be inside the chamber with Saul, and they stood at a distance near the tall gilded doors. And the captain smiled in approval of Saul's bold words. Truly, this was a Roman and not a meek Jew. Saul, in the meantime, had been scrutinizing his judges, and he saw that many were Sadducees and many were Pharisees. Now he gave all his attention to his fellow Pharisees, for he still had a detestation of the worldly and atheistic Sadducees. His voice was still stronger when he addressed the Pharisees only. "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. The hope and the resurrection of the dead I am called in question." This was an astute appeal, for the Sadducees did not believe in any life hereafter, nor did they believe in the resurrection of the dead. And the issue was still bitter between them and the Pharisees, whom they loathed. So the Pharisees glanced in consternation at each other, and one whispered, "He has preached the resurrection of the dead in accordance with the teachings of his fathers, and for this he should be held guilty." Suddenly Saul, and all that he was of lesser importance to the Pharisees than the Sadducees, who believed in no life, nor angel, nor spirit, and the ancient enmity bristled up among the Pharisees. They glared at the Sadducees, who stared back in cold contempt. Why had this man been brought before the Sanhedrin? True, it was said that he was a Nazarene, but he was also a Pharisee of a noble house, and had never repudiated his people nor his sect, but had merely tried to bring the truth of to the misbegotten Gentiles. Was that so sore a crime? Had not the Pharisees for ages proselytized among the Gentiles, bringing thousands of them into the house of Israel? And had they refrained only now because the Romans had commanded them to refrain? The scribes among the Pharisees were suddenly enraged that Saul, who was a Pharisee, was being judged by these Sadducees, and that he had been attacked in the holy temple by order of them, and was almost murdered by the market rabble, and that, shame of shames, he had had to be rescued by the heathen Romans from his own people, and he had been thrust into prison. All the other charges made against Saul through the years in Israel were forgotten. So the scribes of the Pharisees, the intellectuals, who disdained brutality and violence, stood up with a great and angry cry, shouting, "We find no evil in this man, but if an angel or a spirit has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." Instantly, Saul was totally forgotten. The Sadducees rose from their seats and began a furious debate with the Pharisees, so loud and so full of gestures that the captain was fearful again for the life of this Roman citizen, who had shown no fear of those who would have ordered his death. So he advanced with his men and took hold, politely, of Saul, and they led him from the chamber. None saw them go, for now the disputants had come to blows, intellectual scribes and all, gentlemen and scholars, and the captain glanced back once and grinned. The high priest himself was being jostled by sharp elbows, and his stately hat had been knocked from his head. When Saul was safely delivered to his comfortable cell in the fortress, the captain sat down on the table and ordered wine for both of them, and fruit and pastries, and he simmered with amusement. He scratched his bristling pate, and he shook his head. "What immoderate sages and judges," he remarked. And Saul laughed with him. His nose and one of his cheeks were still swollen from the blows he had received last night, and still sore, but he laughed. "There is none so stupid as the wise, it has been written," he remarked, and he drank the wine and ate thoughtfully of the fruit and pastries. He felt a comfort in the presence of this young Roman, and he began to talk to him of his journeys, and his accounts were so fascinating that the captain was reluctant to leave and return to his duties. When the captain was alone, he thought, why did a man of family and wealth leave his country to travel like a miserable slave among other nations, and to bring him a message of redemption? The young captain had been barely born at the time of the crucifixion, and he had heard nothing of it until he had been sent to Israel. It was an awesome and beguiling story, and he did not believe in it at all, as he did not believe in the gods. From what should a man be redeemed? From sin and death, said the Nazarenes and Paul of Tarsus, who was a lawyer and a Roman. The captain was baffled. It was obvious to him that Nazarenes died as easily and as frequently as other men. Therefore, where was their deliverance from death? As for sin, the Jews, faithful and Nazarene, believed all pleasure was sin. And was that not an absurd doctrine and an insult to the gods who made pleasure their entire existence? A great tranquility came to Saul, and he had not slept much the night before because of the pain of his wounds, despite the unguents and the lotions that the captain had ordered to be put on them for healing. Now a sweet exhaustion came to him, and he lay on his cot and began to dream. He saw the Messiah again, the mighty and puissant face, the triumphant and manly eyes, the heroic mouth, and the brow radiating golden lightning. And he said to Saul, "Be of good cheer, Saul, for as you have testified of me in Jerusalem, so must you bear witness also at Rome." The young captain, Claudius Lysias, was in a quandary. He could not keep Saul forever imprisoned, nor could he release him to the vengeance of the high priest Ananias. He was not accustomed to be faced with dilemmas, for life was simple for him. As he was ruminating in his room in the fortress and drinking wine with melancholy determination, his centurion came to him and said, "Captain, there is a certain man who beseeches to speak with you, and his name is Amos ben Ezekiel, a man of distinction and family, and of apparent wealth, for his garments are rich. And he declares that he is the nephew of Paul of Tarsus, and had arrived in Jerusalem only last night. He is also a physician and a citizen of Rome." "Ha," said the captain, conjecturing that perhaps his dilemma was at an end. "Bring him to me at once." The visitor entered, and at his aspect the Roman captain rose slowly, for Amos was tall and dignified, and clad in blue and scarlet silk, and he wore jewels on his hands, and his sandals were gilded. His hair and his beard were mingling of soft gold and white, for Amos was no longer young, but in his middle age. His air of majesty and pride and assurance merited the young captain's respect, and he touched his forehead slightly in a quick salute and offered his visitor a chair and ordered wine. Amos smiled at him gravely and seated himself, and the captain saw the nobility of his features and quietness of his manner. "I thank you, Captain Lysias, for receiving me." And we'll continue with part 2.